When the Pacific War began in 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood as one of the most formidable forces on the planet. Its admirals, hardened by years of naval tradition and buoyed by the stunning success at Pearl Harbor, believed they understood the balance of power at sea. To them, the capital ship was the ultimate measure of naval dominance. Battleships, with their massive guns and towering profiles, and fleet carriers, with their ability to project air power across vast distances, were the heart of strategy. Anything less was a footnote. In this worldview, the small, slow, lightly armed escort carrier was barely worth a second glance. Escort carriers, known in the American Navy as jeep carriers, were never designed to dazzle. They were hastily converted merchant hulls or purpose-built smaller ships, meant to carry a handful of planes, maybe 24 at most. Their flight decks were narrow, their speed sluggish, their armor paper-thin. They lacked the striking power of fleet carriers like the Enterprise or the Yorktown, and they certainly lacked the prestige of battleships like the Iowa. To Japanese admirals steeped in Mahanian doctrine, which emphasized decisive battles between great fleets, escort carriers seemed laughably inadequate. But war has a way of turning weakness into strength. By 1944, the Pacific conflict had transformed beyond what Japan could control. The Allies had embraced total war, and American industry churned out ships at a pace the Japanese could scarcely fathom. While Japan struggled to replace its losses, the United States produced carriers by the dozen. Fleet carriers took time, resources, and skilled labor to construct, but escort carriers could be built quickly, in assembly line fashion, or converted from cargo ships. By mid-1944, dozens were in service, escorting convoys, providing air cover for amphibious landings, and hunting submarines. Japanese admirals continued to dismiss them, even as these small carriers reshaped the battlefield. They saw them as auxiliaries suitable for patrolling sea lanes or ferrying planes, but irrelevant to decisive fleet action. Yet the Americans understood something their opponents did not. In modern naval warfare, ubiquity and utility could be just as decisive as power. Escort carriers could be everywhere, doing everything, freeing up the fleet carriers for the major blow. They became the workhorses of the Pacific, humble, overlooked, but indispensable. The climax of this underestimation came in October 1944. Japan launched what would become the largest naval battle in history, a desperate attempt to repel the American invasion of the Philippines. Their plan, Operation Shogo, called for a complex series of maneuvers to lure away and destroy American forces. Central to the Japanese plan was the assumption that escort carriers, if encountered, could be swept aside easily. They were small, slow, and vulnerable, hardly a threat to battleships and heavy cruisers. Japanese admirals believed victory lay in their grasp. They could not have been more wrong. Off the island of Samar, a group of American escort carriers, known as Taffy 3, found themselves facing the full might of the Japanese center force under Admiral Kurita. On paper, it was suicide. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts faced a fleet that included the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, along with other battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers. The disparity was staggering. The Japanese expected to obliterate them in minutes. Instead, the small American task group fought back with ferocity that stunned the world. The escort carriers launched every aircraft they had, armed or not, sending Avengers and Wildcats into desperate attacks with bombs, depth charges, even machine guns. The destroyers and destroyer escorts charged headlong into the Japanese fleet, launching torpedoes and laying smoke screens to shield the carriers. The tiny jeep carriers themselves maneuvered wildly, dodging shells and air attacks while continuing to launch planes. The Japanese had mocked escort carriers as weak, but that day they proved indomitable. Their aircraft harried the Japanese force relentlessly, damaging cruisers, disrupting formations, and sowing chaos. Their escorts fought with suicidal bravery, crippling larger ships and buying time. Admiral Kurita, bewildered by the ferocity of the defense and believing he faced a much larger force, ultimately withdrew. The escort carriers had survived, and in doing so they had helped turn Leyte Gulf into a decisive American victory. For Japanese admirals, the shock was profound. They had underestimated not just the ships, but the system behind them. Escort carriers could not stand toe-to-toe with battleships, but they were never meant to. Their strength was in numbers, in utility, in their ability to multiply American presence across the Pacific. By dismissing them, Japan had blinded itself to one of America's greatest advantages. The Battle off Samar entered naval legend as one of the most heroic actions of the war. Men aboard Taffy III's carriers and escorts fought with desperation and brilliance, turning what should have been annihilation into triumph. Japanese officers captured after the war admitted their disbelief that such small ships had turned back the laughter that had once greeted the concept of escort carriers was gone. In its place was grudging respect, and the bitter knowledge that they had been defeated by what they once dismissed as insignificant. The escort carriers, mocked as jeeps, had proven that in modern war flexibility and numbers could crush tradition and pride. And for the Imperial Japanese Navy, that realization came too late. The events off Samar in October 1944 were more than an isolated clash. They were the crystallization of a larger truth that Japanese admirals had refused to see. For years they had placed their faith in decisive battles fought by capital ships, guided by the doctrine of Alfred Thayer Mahan and their own naval traditions. The Battle of Tsushima in 1905, when Japan annihilated Russia's fleet with battleships and cruisers, remained their guiding light. That victory had proven the importance of concentrated naval power, and Japanese strategy ever since had been built around repeating it on a larger stage. To them, escort carriers did not fit into this vision. They were auxiliaries, sideshows incapable of influencing the grand contests of war. But the Pacific War had already proven that decisive battles no longer belonged to battleships. Carrier aviation had supplanted gunnery as the dominant factor, and air power had made even the mightiest battleships vulnerable. Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway had all demonstrated this shift. Yet even as Japan recognized the primacy of fleet carriers, its admirals still failed to appreciate the role of smaller ships. Escort carriers were dismissed as little more than transports, useful for ferrying planes or guarding convoys, but irrelevant to true naval power. America, however, saw them differently. The escort carrier was not a symbol of weakness, but of adaptability. Built quickly, operated cheaply, and deployed widely, they were the embodiment of industrial war. They hunted submarines in the Atlantic, shielded convoys in the Pacific, and most importantly, provided close air support for amphibious operations. At Tarawa, Saipan, and Leyte, escort carriers gave Marines and soldiers the air cover they needed to storm beaches. Fleet carriers could not be everywhere at once, but escort carriers could fill the gaps. It was a new kind of strength, not concentrated, but distributed. At Samar, this philosophy was tested under the harshest conditions. The Japanese center force, led by the battleship Yamato and its consorts, represented the old vision of power. Massive ships, bristling with guns, built to crush enemies through sheer firepower. Against them, the 6 escort carriers of Taffy III seemed pitiful. Their planes were few, their escorts outmatched, their survival doubtful. Yet when the clash came, it was the Japanese who faltered. The aircraft launched from the escort carriers proved decisive. Pilots flew mission after mission, strafing decks, dropping bombs, even improvising attacks with whatever weapons they carried. One Avenger pilot, out of bombs and torpedoes, dropped depth charges on a Japanese cruiser simply to keep pressure on the enemy. The damage inflicted was less important than the disruption it caused. Japanese formations scattered, their commanders confused by the relentless assaults. They had expected a pushover. Instead, they found themselves under siege from the very ships they had mocked. The destroyers and destroyer escorts added to the chaos. Charging into battle against vastly superior ships, they launched torpedoes that forced the Japanese to maneuver wildly, breaking their formation. Several cruisers were hit, others damaged, and in the smoke and confusion, the Japanese lost their nerve. Admiral Kurita, convinced he faced a much larger force of fleet carriers, ordered a retreat. What had begun as a mismatch ended in American survival and Japanese humiliation. For Japanese admirals, the shock was personal. They had underestimated not just the carriers, but the men who crewed them. The sailors of Taffy 3 fought with a ferocity that belied their fragile ship. Their courage turned auxiliaries into warriors, and their determination made mockery into legend. To dismiss escort carriers after Samar was impossible. Their role in crushing the Japanese fleet was undeniable. The larger lesson was about adaptability. Japan had invested in a navy it could not replace, built around a philosophy that belonged to another era. America had invested in flexibility, producing ships of every size and type, flooding the oceans with presence. The escort carriers symbolized this approach. They were not glamorous, but they were effective, and in modern war effectiveness mattered more than prestige. After the battle, survivors from both sides reflected on the astonishing reverse. American sailors told stories of watching their small carriers dodge salvo after salvo, from the Yamato, of pilots flying mission after mission until their fuel was nearly gone. Japanese officers admitted their disbelief at being turned back by such tiny ships. One described it as a battle where ants defeated lions. Another remarked that the psychological shock of the escort carrier's resilience was greater than any damage inflicted. Samar became a turning point in perception. What had been mocked was now respected. Japanese admirals who had once dismissed escort carriers as irrelevant now recognized that they represented a new way of war. The United States could afford to lose ships because it could build more. It could afford to risk carriers because they were expendable. And yet, paradoxically, it rarely lost them because their ubiquity made them stronger than they appeared. The crushing of the Imperial Fleet at Leyte Gulf, of which Samar was a vital part, marked the effective end of Japanese naval power. Never again would the Japanese Navy mount a serious challenge to American dominance. Escort carriers, scorned as weak, had played a decisive role in that outcome. For Japan's admirals, it was a bitter pill to swallow. They had mocked the very ships that helped bring about their ruin. The Japanese mockery of escort carriers had deep roots in their naval doctrine. Since the early 20th century, Japan's military leaders had believed that national survival depended on a single decisive battle against a major enemy fleet. This Kanti-Kessen doctrine envisioned massive clashes of battleships and heavy cruisers, where superior training and discipline would ensure Japanese victory. Every major decision in shipbuilding, officer training, and war planning revolved around this concept. In such a framework, small carriers cobbled together from merchant hulls were beneath consideration. This worldview made sense before the rise of air power. In the era of dreadnoughts, the decisive battle theory had delivered victory at Tsushima, where Japan crushed Russia's Baltic fleet. But by the 1940s, warfare had evolved. Aircraft extended the range of combat, submarines menaced supply lines, and radar altered tactics. America understood these changes better than Japan, integrating new technologies into a flexible strategy. Escort carriers epitomized this shift. They were not meant to win battleship duels, but to serve as versatile platforms for air power wherever it was needed. Their roles multiplied as the war progressed. In the Atlantic, escort carriers proved invaluable in closing the mid-ocean air gap, hunting German U-boats that once ravaged Allied convoys. By 1943, U-boat losses skyrocketed under constant surveillance and attack from carrier-based planes. In the Pacific, escort carriers shielded troop convoys, provided close support for landings, and ferried aircraft to forward bases. What Japanese admirals dismissed as auxiliary functions turned out to be central to sustaining the Allied war effort. Without escort carriers, amphibious invasions like Tarawa and Saipan would have faced catastrophic losses. The irony was that Japan's contempt for escort carriers blinded it to their true value. Even as American forces mass-produced them, Japanese strategists failed to develop an equivalent. They clung to their dwindling fleet carriers, pouring scarce resources into ships they could not replace. When losses at Midway crippled their offensive capacity, Japan never recovered. The Americans, by contrast, treated carriers of all sizes as parts of a larger machine. The fleet carriers delivered knockout blows, but the escort carriers ensured that every other punch landed. The turning point came at Leyte Gulf, where these small ships faced the Japanese center force. To understand the scale of their achievement, one must appreciate the disparity. On October 25, 1944, Taffy 3's 6 escort carriers carried about 450 men each and operated roughly 24 planes apiece. Their top speed was 17 knots, barely fast enough to escape pursuit. Their armor was so thin that even near misses from heavy shells could cripple them. Against them, Admiral Kurita, brought the Yamato and 3 other battleships, along with 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Japanese force displaced nearly 1 million tons of steel, bristling with guns capable of hurling shells weighing more than a ton each. By every measure it was a mismatch, yet in practice, the mismatch favored the Americans. Their escort carriers, though weak individually, worked as part of a larger system. As Kurita's fleet bore down, the carriers scrambled every plane they had. Pilots attacked without hesitation, regardless of whether they were fully armed. Bombs, torpedoes, and even strafing runs kept the Japanese off balance. Meanwhile, the destroyers accompanying the carriers charged directly into the enemy, launching torpedoes that forced even the mighty Yamato to turn aside. Smoke screens obscured the carriers, and frantic maneuvering made them harder targets than expected. The result was chaos. Japanese cruisers were damaged or sunk, their formations shattered. Pilots returning from sorties reported seeing enemy battleships veering off course, convinced they faced a full task force of fleet carriers. The illusion worked. Kurita, rattled and uncertain, ultimately chose to withdraw rather than press his advantage. He had been bluffed by a force he had considered laughable. For Japanese admirals, the shock of Samar went beyond the tactical defeat. It was a blow to their worldview. They had long insisted that small ships could not influence great battles. Yet here, in one of the largest naval clashes in history, tiny escort carriers had done precisely that. They had fought off battleships, heavy cruisers and destroyers, not by brute strength but by adaptability, courage and relentless air power. The aftermath of Samar left Japanese officers reeling. Survivors described their disbelief at being driven back by ships they had mocked. One officer later wrote, "We thought them weak but they were strong, not because of their guns but because of their spirit." The recognition came too late. The Imperial Japanese Navy had gambled everything on its capital ships, only to see them humbled by auxiliary. Meanwhile, in the United States, the victory at Samar became a rallying cry. Newspapers celebrated the baby flat-tops and the destroyers that had charged to protect them. For the men of Taffy 3, it was immortality. Their bravery turned the tide of battle and cemented the role of escort carriers in naval history. By dismissing escort carriers, Japanese admirals had committed one of their gravest strategic errors. They failed to see that war in the 20th century was no longer about prestige ships alone. It was about systems, about combining resources, about overwhelming the enemy with adaptability. The escort carriers were proof of that. In their humility lay their power, and by mocking them, Japan had sealed its own fate. The Battle of Samar exposed not only Japanese miscalculations, but also the genius of American adaptation. Escort carriers were never intended to fight surface actions against battleships, yet in the desperate crucible of Leyte Gulf, they proved capable of defying expectation. What mattered was not their individual strength but the system in which they operated, a system that combined air cover, destroyer support, and relentless improvisation. Japanese admirals, so certain of their superiority, could not comprehend how such small ships had turned back one of the largest fleets ever assembled. At its core, this was a story of numbers and logistics. The United States had built escort carriers in staggering quantity. By late 1944, more than 70 were in service in the Pacific alone. These vessels, built quickly and cheaply, could be deployed anywhere. While Japan struggled to replace its fleet carriers after Midway and the Marianas, America was launching new escort carriers faster than they could be counted. To Japanese planners, accustomed to slow and careful shipbuilding, this pace was inconceivable. Their contempt for escort carriers blinded them to the reality: quantity had a quality all its own. The industrial imbalance extended to aircraft as well. Each escort carrier might only carry 24 planes, but when dozens of such carriers operated together, their collective power rivaled that of fleet carriers. These planes did not need to sink battleships on their own. They needed only to harass, distract, and delay. At Samar, Avengers and Wildcats flew sortie after sortie, often attacking with whatever weapons were on hand. Japanese cruisers took hits from bombs and torpedoes, while battleships were forced to maneuver constantly, disrupting their fire. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and the escort carriers made it possible. The courage of their escorts amplified this effect. The destroyers Johnston, Hole, and Herman, along with the destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts and Raymond, charged into the Japanese fleet with suicidal determination. Their torpedoes forced heavy cruisers to turn away,
and their gunfire inflicted unexpected damage. The Samuel B. Roberts, later nicknamed the destroyer Escort that fought like a battleship, exemplified this spirit. Japanese officers later admitted their astonishment at such reckless bravery. To them it seemed irrational, but it was precisely this defiance that saved the carriers. For Admiral Kureta, commanding the Japanese center force, the battle was a nightmare. He had expected to sweep aside auxiliaries, but instead he found himself under relentless attack from planes and destroyers. Reports from his ships exaggerated the opposition, convincing him he faced fleet carriers rather than escort carriers. This illusion, reinforced by the chaos of battle, led him to withdraw. Japanese admirals later debated his decision bitterly, but the fact remained: he had been turned back by ships his navy had mocked. The strategic consequences were immense. By failing to break through at Leyte, the Japanese Navy lost its last chance to disrupt the American invasion of the Philippines. Without control of the Philippines, Japan's supply lines to Southeast Asia were cut. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, vital to fueling its navy, could no longer reach home waters. The Imperial Fleet, already crippled, was now effectively finished as a fighting force. Escort carriers had played a pivotal role in this collapse.
For the Americans, the lesson was clear. No ship was too small to make a difference if it was used creatively. The escort carriers had bought time, inflicted damage, and most importantly, bluffed an enemy into retreat. Their presence alone had been enough to unnerve a fleet built on pride and tradition. This inversion of expectations humiliated Japanese admirals who had once seen naval warfare as a contest of giants. Now they had been beaten by what they considered nuts. The cultural shock was profound. Japan's naval tradition was steeped in honor, discipline, and the pursuit of decisive battle. The idea that small, expendable ships could alter the course of history was alien to them. Yet that was precisely what had happened at some. The escort carriers had demonstrated that adaptability, improvisation, and sheer determination could outweigh prestige and firepower. For Japanese admirals, this was a lesson they learned too late. In the months that followed, escort carriers continued to prove their worth. They supported landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, providing close air support for ground forces and shielding convoys from kamikaze attacks. Many were damaged or sunk, but replacements arrived almost instantly. America's industrial might ensured that losses were irrelevant. For every carrier destroyed, another was already on its way. Japanese admirals could only watch in frustration as the jeep carriers multiplied across the Pacific, swarming the ocean with a presence they could not challenge. The symbolism was inescapable. Escort carriers, once mocked, had crushed the last hopes of the Imperial Fleet. They were not glamorous, but they were effective. They embodied America's approach to war: flexible, relentless, and rooted in production. For Japan, the humiliation was total. The mighty battleships and cruisers of their navy had been humbled not by peers, but by auxiliaries. By 1945, the transformation was complete. The Japanese navy that had once ruled the Pacific was shattered, and the escort carriers played no small part in its destruction. What had been ridiculed as weak had proven decisive. Japanese admirals, reflecting on the war, admitted their astonishment. They had underestimated the very ships that symbolized America's strength. The laughter that once greeted the escort carriers had turned to silence, replaced by the bitter recognition that they had been crushed by what they had mocked. The story of escort carriers was not simply about one battle, but about the transformation of naval warfare itself. For decades, admirals across the world had measured power by tonnage and caliber, by the size of battleships and the reach of their guns. Escort carriers shattered that worldview. They were proof that victory did not always belong to the largest or most powerful ships, but to the vessels that could be built in numbers, deployed flexibly, and used where they were most needed. To Japanese admirals, this was an unthinkable inversion of the old order. To the Americans, it was common sense. American industry thrived on standardization. The same production methods that had once built automobiles now built escort carriers. Merchant hulls were converted rapidly, while new designs were stamped out in shipyards across the country. These ships were inexpensive, practical, and most importantly, available in overwhelming numbers. By 1945, More than 100 escort carriers had been launched. They spread across every ocean, providing air cover for convoys, supporting amphibious operations, and reinforcing the reach of America's global power. Japan could not compete. Its shipbuilding industry was limited, its resources strained, and its ability to replace losses crippled by Allied bombing. While the United States launched carriers in weeks, Japan struggled to complete even one in months. The gap widened. Relentless. Japanese admirals watched as their once proud fleet shrank, while the Americans seemed to grow stronger every day. Escort carriers were a visible sign of this imbalance. Where Japan had none, America had too many to count. The psychological blow was immense. Japanese sailors had been raised on stories of naval glory, of decisive battles where battleships crushed enemies with thunderous broadsides. To find themselves harassed, bloodied, and ultimately defeated by baby flat-tops was humiliating. Survivors of Samar recalled their disbelief as aircraft from escort carriers swarmed their ships, dropping bombs and torpedoes with relentless determination. The laughter that had once greeted the notion of escort carriers had turned to fear and confusion. American commanders understood this dynamic well. They knew that the value of escort carriers was not in their individual strength, but in their collective presence. A single escort carrier might be weak, but a dozen could dominate an ocean. Their planes could scout, strike, and defend. Their escorts could shield them with torpedoes and smoke. Together they created a web of power that stretched across the Pacific. Fleet carriers still delivered the decisive blows, but escort carriers made those blows possible by sustaining the broader war effort. At Leyte Gulf, this philosophy reached its climax. The Japanese fleet, built on old assumptions of power, had gambled everything on a decisive encounter. But instead of crushing America's main carriers, they stumbled into the resilience of Taft. The mismatch that should have ensured Japanese victory instead exposed the fatal weakness of their doctrine. Escort carriers did not fight on Japanese terms. They fought on their own, and in doing so they turned mockery into triumph. The legacy of Samar spread quickly. American newspapers hailed the courage of the escort carriers and their escorts, turning them into national heroes. Japanese survivors, meanwhile, carried the bitter memory of being turned back by ships they had despised. For the admirals who had built their careers on the pursuit of decisive battle, the realization was crushing. They had been beaten not by the giants of war, but by the smallest carriers afloat. The contrast with America's approach was stark. The United States had embraced flexibility, recognizing that war was not only about decisive moments, but about sustaining pressure day after day. Escort carriers embodied that philosophy. They could be everywhere, doing everything, ensuring that the enemy never found relief. For Japan, locked into rigid doctrine, there was no answer. Their fleet shrank, their pilots dwindled, their oil ran out. Meanwhile, America's jeep carriers kept multiplying, kept launching planes, kept shaping battles in ways Japanese admirals had never anticipated. This was not merely a tactical failure, it was a cultural one. Japan had mocked weakness and exalted strength. America had embraced practicality and overwhelmed its enemy with it. Escort carriers, small and unglamorous, became the perfect symbol of this victory. They were underestimated, ridiculed, even despised. Yet in the end they crushed the Imperial Fleet. By 1945, the once proud Japanese Navy was broken. Its battleships lay at the bottom of the ocean. Its carriers burned or abandoned. Its admirals discredited. The empire that had dreamed of ruling the Pacific was left defenseless before the relentless tide of American power. Escort carriers had not achieved this alone, but they had played a decisive role. They had proven that mockery was no shield against adaptability, and that in war the underestimated often carry the day. The defeat at Leyte Gulf marked more than the collapse of Japan's naval strength. It marked the collapse of its naval philosophy. For decades, Japanese admirals had believed that power was measured in great ships and decisive engagements. But in the crucible of the Pacific, that belief had been tested and shattered. The Americans had built a navy not just of giants but of countless workhorses. And it was the workhorses that had carried the war forward. Escort carriers illustrated this truth more clearly than any other vessel. They were never designed for glory. Their flight decks were short, their hangars cramped, their defenses minimal. They lacked the speed to chase or the armor to endure. Yet precisely because they were humble, they could be built quickly and in numbers. And in a war defined by scale, numbers mattered most. The Japanese could not understand this at first, trapped in a doctrine that prized perfection over practicality. By the time they did, the damage was done. American strategy leveraged escort carriers in every theater. In the Atlantic, they strangled the U-boat menace. In the Pacific, they supported landings across island chains that stretched thousands of miles. They ferried aircraft, provided anti-submarine patrols, and gave soldiers the air cover they needed to seize beachheads. Their flexibility was unmatched. Japanese admirals, locked into rigid categories of decisive and auxiliary, failed to grasp the power of versatility. To them, a ship that did not fit their model of glory was irrelevant. To America, such ships were indispensable. The cultural arrogance behind this blindness was stark. Japanese naval officers had been trained to worship tradition, to see the battleship as a symbol of national pride and the decisive battle as destiny. When escort carriers appeared, they dismissed them as weak, unworthy of consideration. But in doing so, they revealed their own inability to adapt. The Americans, by contrast, had no such pride. They embraced whatever worked, whether glamorous or not. The escort carrier, mocked as a jeep, became the perfect expression of that pragmatism. At Samar, this difference was exposed brutally. Japanese sailors and officers expected the escort carriers to flee and die quietly. Instead, they fought with tenacity that stunned the enemy. Pilots attacked again and again, destroyers hurled themselves into suicidal charges, and the carriers themselves dodged salvo after salvo while still launching planes. The Japanese had believed they faced weakness. Instead, they encountered resilience, and resilience, multiplied by numbers and backed by industry, proved stronger than prestige. The shock lingered long after the guns fell silent. Japanese officers who survived described their disbelief in memoirs and interrogation. They admitted they had underestimated their opponent, not just in ships but in spirit. One recalled the frustration of watching destroyer escorts charge battleships with reckless courage. Another marveled at the coordination of carriers and escorts fighting as one despite being so outmatched. Their ridicule had turned to respect, but respect that came too late. For American sailors, the victory at Samar became a legend of courage. The names of ships like Samuel B. Roberts and Johnston entered history as symbols of defiance. But beneath the heroism lay a larger truth. The escort carriers had fulfilled their purpose. They had survived, they had shielded the invasion, and they had forced the Japanese to retreat. Their very existence, multiplied across the Pacific, had reshaped the war. By 1945, the escort carrier had become a cornerstone of American naval power. They operated in groups, supporting each other and extending the reach of the fleet. They were expendable, but in practice they rarely were because their numbers and adaptability made them hard to kill. For every carrier sunk, another was waiting. For every ship damaged, replacements sailed in convoys across the Pacific. Japanese admirals who had once mocked them now faced a reality where these small ships seemed endless. The irony was cruel. Japan had poured its resources into the Yamato and its sister ship, the largest battleships ever built. These leviathans were symbols of pride, armed with massive guns and thick armor, yet both were sunk by American aircraft, their size rendering them targets rather than saviors. Meanwhile, the escort carriers, small and unassuming, outlasted the giants. Japanese pride had built monuments, American pragmatism had built tools, and tools, multiplied endlessly, had won. The collapse of the Imperial Navy was the final proof. Without carriers to project power, without oil to fuel them, and without the ability to adapt, Japan's fleet faded into irrelevance. Escort carriers, once dismissed as auxiliaries, had played a central role in that collapse. They had been mocked, but they had crushed the pride of an empire. For Japanese admirals, it was the bitterest lesson. In modern war, humility and flexibility were stronger than arrogance and tradition. By the time 1945 dawned, the Imperial Japanese Navy was little more than a shadow of its former self. The fleet that had once terrified the Pacific now lacked the ships, the fuel and the trained sailors to mount serious operations. Yet what stunned Japanese admirals most was not just the scale of their losses, but the way those losses had been inflicted. They had been undone not only by fleet carriers, submarines and battleships, but by the very ships they had mocked, escort carriers.
Everywhere the Japanese turned, the baby flat-tops seemed to appear. At Okinawa, they provided relentless air support for Marines storming the beach. At Iwo Jima, their aircraft flew countless sorties, strafing bunkers, bombing artillery, and shielding troops from counterattacks. Even in the most dangerous waters, they pressed forward. Kamikaze pilots targeted them repeatedly, sinking and damaging several. But for every escort carrier lost, another soon arrived, fresh from American shipyards. The Japanese could not comprehend such abundance. The system behind it was breathtaking in its efficiency. America's industrial machine operated like an extension of the battle. Escort carriers could be built in mere months, launched from shipyards that never slept, and sent immediately into service. Merchant hulls were converted into carriers with astonishing speed. To Japanese admirals raised on the slow pace of battleship construction, this felt like sorcery. They had believed that prestige ships defined wars. The Americans showed that it was not prestige, but production that mattered most. The irony was cruelly clear when contrasted with Japan's own effort. Their great hope, the battleship Yamato, represented the height of traditional thinking: massive guns, thick armor, overwhelming size. Yet in April 1945, Yamato was sent on a desperate suicide mission to Okinawa, and sunk by waves of American carrier aircraft. Escort carriers helped coordinate those strikes, part of a swarm of American air power that made the largest battleship in history obsolete. The very ships Japanese admirals had ridiculed played a role in dooming their most prized vessel. For the Japanese Navy, the humiliation was total. They had dismissed escort carriers as irrelevant, yet those carriers had proven essential in every campaign of the Pacific. They did not fight for prestige, but for they supported landings, hunted submarines, shielded convoys, and at Sama turned back a fleet that should have annihilated them. Mocked as auxiliaries, they had written themselves into legend. The cultural contrast between the two nations could not have been sharp. Japan exalted tradition, discipline, and the pursuit of decisive battle. America exalted adaptability, abundance, and pragmatism. Escort carriers embodied this American ethos. They were tools, simple, expendable, effective. Japanese admirals failed to see that tools, multiplied endlessly, were stronger than monuments built for pride. By clinging to outdated ideas, they had guaranteed their own In interrogations after the war, Japanese officers admitted their astonishment at the effectiveness of the escort carriers. One confessed that he had believed they were targets, nothing more, until Sama proved otherwise. Another lamented that Japan had never built anything similar, noting that such ships could have transformed their own ability to guard convoys or support landings. These realizations came too late. America had embraced the future while Japan had clung to the past. The psychological blow lingered. For men who had dedicated their lives to battleships and decisive battle doctrine, it was devastating to realize that their fleet had been undone by vessels they had dismissed. Escort carriers had been symbols of weakness, until they became symbols of victory. Their very existence was a rebuke to the arrogance of Japan's naval philosophy. By the summer of 1945, as the war neared its end, escort carriers still filled the sea. They supported the bombing of Japan itself, launching planes that struck coastal defenses, shipping lanes, and isolated garrisons. They were everywhere, reminders of American reach and determination. To the few Japanese ships that remained, they were inescapable. Small though they were, they had become giants in their own right. The laughter of Japanese admirals had long since faded. In its place was silence, and the recognition that the Imperial Fleet had been crushed by what it had mocked. The escort carriers were not glamorous, but they were decisive, and in the final reckoning, that was all that mattered. The enduring irony of escort carriers was that their very weaknesses became their strengths. They were small, slow, and lightly armed, which meant they could be built rapidly and deployed in staggering numbers. They lacked the striking power of fleet carriers, but they freed those fleet carriers to focus on decisive missions. They lacked armor, but their expendability meant commanders were willing to risk them in dangerous waters. To the Japanese, this seemed absurd. To the Americans, it was brilliant. This brilliance became most visible in the island-hopping campaigns of 1944, and every major amphibious assault required close air support, reconnaissance, and protection against enemy submarine. Fleet carriers could not linger over beachheads for weeks on end. They had to remain mobile, ready for major battles. Escort carriers filled the gap. At Saipan, Guam and Pelileo, they flew hundreds of sorties each day, pounding enemy positions and shielding Marines as they advanced in. Japanese troops entrenched in caves and bunkers were stunned by the unrelenting air cover. These were not fleet carriers, these were the jeep carriers the admirals had laughed at. Yet they were the ones breaking resistance on the beaches. The kamikaze campaign only reinforced their value. Beginning in late 1944, waves of suicide aircraft hurled themselves at the American fleet, sinking and damaging many ships. Escort carriers bore much of this punishment. Ships like the St. Lo, sunk off Lake, became tragic symbols of sacrifice. But their loss did not cripple operation. For every escort carrier destroyed, another was already en route. America's shipyards ensured that no gap remained for long. Japanese admirals had once dismissed them as expendable. America had embraced that very truth, turning expendability into invincibility. The Japanese Navy could not adjust. Their fleet carriers were too precious to risk, and their battleships were already obsolete. They had no equivalent to the escort carrier, no vessel cheap enough to build in numbers yet versatile enough to serve in countless roles. As the war ground on, their failure to adapt became catastrophic. The Americans overwhelmed them, not only with strength, but with creativity. The very ships they mocked became the backbone of an unstoppable advance. At the strategic level, escort carriers also reshaped the balance of power. They allowed the United States to project air cover over convoys and amphibious assaults across thousands of miles of ocean. They multiplied presence in ways Japan could not match. When Admiral Kurita turned back at Samar, he was not just retreating from 6 escort carriers, he was retreating from an entire system of warfare that Japan could not defeat. Each jeep carrier represented not only its aircraft and escorts, but the factories that built it, the convoys that sustained it, and the doctrine that empowered it. The Japanese recognition of this truth came slowly and always too late. Many officers admitted after the war that they had underestimated American adaptability. They had expected a rigid opponent, tied to machines and dependent on numbers. What they encountered instead was ingenuity, pragmatism, and a willingness to risk even the smallest ships in bold action. The Americans had turned mockery into advantage, and the Japanese had paid the price.
The human element cannot be overlooked. The sailors aboard escort carriers often knew their ships were vulnerable, yet they fought with courage that rivaled any battleship crew. Pilots flew missions from short decks under constant threat. Mechanics kept planes flying despite cramped conditions, and gunners manned their stations against kamikaze attacks. Their resolve made escort carriers far more than auxiliary ships. They became instruments of willpower, amplifying America's industrial strength with human determination. By mid-1945, Japanese admirals could only watch as escort carriers ringed their home islands, part of the massive fleet preparing for an invasion of Japan. They had once scoffed at these small ships. Now they feared them. Each represented a swarm of aircraft, a shield for landing forces, and a symbol of inexhaustible strength. The Imperial Navy, once confident in its superiority, had been undone by what it mocked. In hindsight, historians see the escort carrier as one of the most important ships of the Second World War, not because it was powerful on its own, but because it embodied the principles that defined America's victory: adaptability, mass production, and relentless persistence. The Japanese had believed that prestige and perfection defined power. The Americans proved that practicality and numbers won wars. The Battle off Samar had shown the world that even the smallest carriers could change history. For Japan's admirals, the humiliation was complete. Their laughter at escort carriers had echoed in war councils and strategy sessions for years. By 1945, that laughter was gone. What replaced it was silence, and the bitter realization that they had been defeated by what they had dismissed. The image of escort carriers at war remained burned into the memories of those who faced them. Japanese sailors who had grown up believing in the supremacy of mighty battleships were astonished to see such small ships wield such outsized influence. Escort carriers were slow, their silhouettes unimpressive, their defenses fragile, yet they multiplied endlessly and their swarms of aircraft stung harder than the largest naval guns. For Japanese admirals who clung to Kantai-Kessen doctrine, this was a humiliation more bitter than defeat itself. At Leyte Gulf, the lesson had been delivered in fire and chaos. The Yamato and her escorts had turned away not because of damage alone, but because they had lost their nerve in the face of unexpected resistance. Escort carriers, supported by destroyers that fought with suicidal courage, had defied every assumption of naval warfare. What Japanese officers dismissed as auxiliaries became the symbol of their undoing. Historians later noted that the greatest achievement of the escort carriers at Samar was psychological. They had convinced the enemy that a much larger force opposed them. Illusion, multiplied by bravery, had trumped firepower. In later campaigns, their contribution was quieter but just as decisive. At Iwo Jima, escort carriers flew endless sorties over black volcanic sand, hammering Japanese defenses that seemed impossible to crack. At Okinawa, they endured relentless kamikaze attacks, some burning to the waterline, others sunk in firestorms, yet replacements arrived constantly, ensuring that air cover never faltered. Japanese admirals watched with disbelief as America treated the loss of a carrier, once the rarest and most devastating setback, as an inconvenience quickly rectified. For a nation that had seen the loss of 4 fleet carriers at Midway as catastrophic, this resilience was beyond comprehension. The root of this difference lay in industry. Escort carriers could be built by the dozen, because American shipyards operated like extensions of the battlefield. Production was decentralized, standardized, and relentless. Hulls were laid down, converted, and launched in a rhythm that never broke. Japanese industry, strained and bombed, could not compete. The Imperial Navy clung to its dwindling capital ships, while America flooded the seas with practical vessels. Japanese admirals realized too late that modern war was not about singular masterpieces but about endless production. The mockery they had once aimed at escort carriers turned inward. Some officers in post-war interviews admitted that their arrogance had blinded them. One reflected that Japan's refusal to build smaller, flexible carriers had been a fatal mistake. Another acknowledged that America's use of escort carriers represented a kind of strategic genius, spreading power across many ships rather than concentrating it in a few. These admissions, though rare, revealed the depth of their regret. For the Americans, escort carriers became symbols of quiet heroism. They lacked the glamour of fleet carriers, but the sailors who served on them knew their importance. They flew into danger, launched desperate strikes, and absorbed punishment without hesitation. The courage of their crews turned mockery into legend. At Samar, pilots who dropped depth charges on heavy cruisers simply to keep pressure on the enemy embodied this spirit. Their determination gave the baby flat-tops a reputation that belied their size. By the time the war ended, the escort carrier had reshaped the way navies thought about power. No longer could admirals assume that only battleships or fleet carriers determined outcomes. Small ships, built in numbers, could change the tide of war. They extended reach, multiplied strength, and compensated for losses. For Japan, which had failed to grasp this lesson, the cost was total defeat. The Imperial Navy's reliance on prestige vessels like the Yamato had left it vulnerable to obsolescence. The Americans had demonstrated that versatility mattered more than grandeur. Escort carriers, ridiculed as weak, had outlasted the strongest battleships afloat. Their aircraft crippled cruisers, harassed destroyers, and broke the morale of entire fleet. Against such persistence, Japan's navy crumbled. By 1945, Japanese admirals had no laughter left. They had watched their empire's fleet shattered by what they once mocked. Escort carriers had proven indispensable in every campaign, from guarding convoys to breaking the back of the Imperial Fleet. Their small decks had launched planes that sank giants, defended landings, and turned defeat into victory. In the final reckoning, the sneers of Japan's naval elite had been answered with silence. The silence of a fleet destroyed. By the final year of the Pacific War, the story of escort carriers had become inseparable from the story of American victory. They were everywhere, in the Atlantic shepherding convoys, in the Pacific supporting landings, in the skies over Okinawa fending off kamikaze. Their versatility gave the Allies endurance, their numbers gave them inevitability, and their courage gave them legend. For Japanese admirals who had once laughed at their existence, there was no denying the truth. The escort carrier had helped crush the Imperial Fleet. At Leyte Gulf, the humiliation had been public. The mighty Yamato and her escorts had turned back from 6 small carriers, their shells and torpedoes wasted against enemies they had thought irrelevant. At Iwo Jima, Japanese garrisons learned firsthand the relentless sting of aircraft launched from jeep carriers. At Okinawa, kamikazes threw themselves at these ships in fiery desperation, sinking some and mauling others, but never slowing the tide. Every time one was lost, another arrived. The Japanese Navy, already bled white, could not fathom such resilience. The secret lay in America's industrial philosophy. Escort carriers were never built to be perfect. They were built to be enough. They could launch planes, protect soldiers, and provide cover. They could be built quickly, maintained easily, and replaced endlessly. Fleet carriers were precious, but escort carriers were plentiful, and in modern war, plentiful mattered more. Japanese admirals who had tied their fate to giant battleships and fleet carriers had no count. The difference was starkest when comparing Yamato's fate to that of the escort carriers. Yamato, the pride of the Japanese Navy, represented years of labor, mountains of steel, and rivers of fuel. She sailed only once into decisive battle, and never returned. Escort carriers, meanwhile, could be launched in months, replaced in weeks, and deployed anywhere. America lost some, but the fleet never faltered. The Japanese bet everything on singular giants. America bet on endless tools. History judged the latter as the wiser gamble. The human element gave the story its depth. Sailors aboard escort carriers knew their vulnerability, yet they stood their ground. Pilots launched from tiny decks with minimal preparation, flying into storms of anti-aircraft fire. Destroyer crews fought with reckless abandon to shield their carriers. Their courage transformed auxiliaries into legends. The tale of Taffy 3, destroyers charging battleships, pilots dropping depth charges on cruisers, became immortal, a reminder that bravery could magnify even the humblest of ships. Japanese officers, captured after the war, admitted their astonishment. One described the Battle of Samar as a nightmare where ants defied lions. Another confessed that he had believed escort carriers were targets, nothing more, until their aircraft crippled his crews. Their mockery had been sincere, but Samar and the subsequent campaigns had turned that mockery into shame. For historians, the lesson of escort carriers is enduring. They proved that naval power was no longer about prestige alone. It was about systems, about the marriage of industry, adaptability, and courage. They showed that small ships, when multiplied and properly employed, could change the course of history. They crushed not only Japan's fleet, but its naval philosophy, proving that the future belonged to flexibility, not rigidity. By August 1945, as Japan surrendered, the escort carriers still sailed, surrounding the home islands, supporting occupation forces, and standing as visible proof of America's inexhaustible strength. For Japanese admirals, the silence was deafening. They had once laughed at these ships. Now they knew that laughter had been the sound of their own defeat. The escort carrier, mocked as the Jeep carrier, had become one of the most decisive weapons of the war. It had been underestimated, ridiculed, but it had outlasted battleships, humbled fleets, and proven that in modern war, the underestimated often carry the day. Japanese admirals had learned this lesson too late, and their empire had paid the price. The surrender of Japan in August 1945 ended the Pacific War, but for Japanese admirals reflecting in defeat, the humiliation carried echoes far deeper than lost ships or shattered harbors. They had misjudged their enemy, not only in spirit, but in strategy. Nowhere was this more evident than in their treatment of the escort carrier. What they had mocked as useless auxiliaries had become a symbol of America's overwhelming strength, and their own blind. In post-war interrogations, many officers admitted their shock at the role these Jeep carriers played. They confessed that they had assumed such ships could not withstand serious combat. They had expected them to crumble when faced with battleships and cruisers, yet Samar proved otherwise. They recalled their disbelief when aircraft from escort carriers crippled cruisers, forced battleships to turn, and harassed them with attacks that never ceased. The destroyers that shielded them, fighting against hopeless odds, only deepened the shame. To be turned back by such a force was to have one's worldview inverted in an instant. The truth was that America had fought a different kind of war. Japan built for prestige, America for practicality. Japan sought decisive duels. America embraced attrition and endurance. Escort carriers were the purest symbol of this philosophy. They were expendable, but that very expendability made them invincible. For every ship lost, another replaced it. For every damaged deck, another launched planes near. To the Japanese, who had gambled everything on singular giants like Yamato,
This abundance was unimaginable, yet it was abundance, not austerity, that determined victory. Culturally, this was a devastating revelation. The Imperial Navy had built itself on honor and sacrifice, believing that glory lay in great battles and monumental ships. Escort carriers mocked that belief simply by existing. They were not glorious, they were not monumental, they were workhorses, humble, practical, tireless, and in the end, they were the ships that broke the back of the Imperial Fleet. The laughter of Japanese admirals had, in hindsight, been the laughter of men clinging to the past. For America, the legacy was different. Escort carriers became quiet heroes of the war, remembered not for glamour, but for endurance. Veterans recalled their cramped decks, their constant flights, their vulnerability to kamikaze. They also recalled their pride in keeping convoys safe, pride in supporting landings, pride in standing firm at Samar. The baby flat-tops had earned their place in history, not by being perfect, but by being present. Historians today see the escort carrier as a turning point in naval warfare. They embodied the shift from prestige to practicality, from decisive battle doctrine to sustained operations. They proved that small ships, multiplied by industry and courage, could humble empire. For Japan, their story is a warning about arrogance. For America, their story is a testament to adaptability. For the world, their story is a reminder that victory often comes from what is underestimated. In the ruins of Tokyo Bay, as Japanese officials signed the instruments of surrender aboard the USS Missouri, the truth was already plain. The Imperial Navy was gone, its battleships sunk, its carriers lost, its admirals discredited. And among the countless forces that had destroyed it, the escort carrier stood tall, not because it was mighty, but because it was many, not because it was invincible, but because it endured. It was the ship Japan had laughed at, and the ship that helped end its empire. The laughter was gone now. In its place was silence, and the bitter knowledge that the smallest ships had taught the largest lessons. Escort carriers mocked as weak, had crushed the Imperial Fleet.